So we'll make a start, I guess. Welcome everyone to day 2. We are still waiting on one more speaker. Joe Farinu is supposed to be joining us, so hopefully he can get on shortly. Our other 2 speakers are here. We've got Susan Donaldson and David Trigger. We've got a lot to move through with 3 speakers, so we might just make a start. We're going to go 15 minutes each. We'll have Susan first since Joe hasn't arrived. Hopefully Joe can turn up in time, and then David will be the 3rd speaker ideally. And then we'll hopefully have about 15 minutes at the end for questions and answers. So I'll just hand over to Susan and she can get us started.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, so my name is Susan Donaldson and I am a consultant anthropologist. I'm sitting in Moruya on the south coast of New South Wales in Walbunja country. Hello to everybody. Today I will briefly speak about an interpretive report I produced for a PBC in the Northern Territory. A little bit of background for people that don't know the region. The Warramunga language region lies in the central desert of the Northern Territory, within which the Parta landholding group are the traditional owners of Tennant Creek and surrounds. The Parta group have been involved in claiming back their traditional lands since the late 1970s, when research began for the Warramunga land claim under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act. Subsequent to this claim, which was finalised in 1988, the Parta group were involved in 3 native title claims, each achieving consent determination. These claims covered the township of Tennant Creek, Phillip Creek Station and Tennant Creek Station. The anthropological research for these various claims spanned 4 decades and involved multiple generations of Aboriginal informants. A few of the informants involved in the 1970s and 1980s claims were able to contribute to the native title research I undertook from 2004. As for the generations after them, whilst they were not key informants in the past, they had witnessed the action. They had listened to what their parents and grandparents had said to the anthropologists, to the lawyers and to the Land Commissioner. Many were also familiar with the Land Commissioner's report and previous ethnographic material produced, including by Spencer and Gillen, Stanner and Strello. As the lead anthropological researcher in the 3 native title cases, I was often asked by my informants, what did the old people say? That is, what information did their forebears share with previous anthropologists and to the Land Commissioner? Why was I asking the same questions when the answers were already in the book? At the time, I was trying to understand people's contemporary connections and how these connections related to the past or not. My informants were adamant in their desire to follow the same laws, customs, and in particular, the same land tenure system as their ancestors. Their desire to describe the same system to me as to what I would find in the written record was, according to them, an act of respect to previous informants who had died, as well as a way to avoid breaking their own law and in turn facing traditional punishment. Some informants wanted to check the accuracy of their own recollections against what was said in the past, in lieu of seeking validation from people who no longer existed. And I'm sure most anthropologists have experienced these types of requests during their own native title research. At the time, the Central Land Council had a process of repatriating land claim materials, mainly genealogies. I remained separate from handing back the requested cultural information because I felt the process had the potential to compromise the integrity of my own research data. Whilst I had a comprehensive understanding of the ethnographic record, I wasn't prepared to give people the answers to my questions and in turn failed to correctly understand the traditional laws and customs observed by the applicants. Then in 2017, a colleague and I were engaged by the Central Land Council and the Parta PBC to undertake a project aimed at building the decision-making capacity of Parta estate group members and in turn enable them to better manage their native title. So a little bit of context, just briefly, the Parta PBC is associated with the native title determination area covering the township of Tennant Creek. The PBC is affiliated with just one landholding group, the very small Parta group. Parta name derives from the association with a discrete area of particularly hard ground within Warramunga country. The estate is surrounded by larger estates affiliated with more robust groups. The group from time to time lacks senior knowledgeable patrilineal members and has often a heavy dependency on senior male and female outside Gurunguru sourced from neighbouring groups. And whilst the Pata PBC rulebook states that only Pata native title holders are eligible to become members of the corporation, some members of the PBC are not Pata. So the purpose of the project I was involved in was designed by the Pata PBC and unsurprisingly involved a presentation about what the old people said in relation to land ownership, estate group structure, traditional decision-making roles and so on. Once again, the native title holders wanted to adhere to the land tenure system that had been set by their ancestors as a way to navigate through the hard decisions facing the PBC and as a way to deal with conflict relating to the ownership of country and in turn PBC membership. It was apparent that the few senior Pata people knew their system but needed support to effectively explain it to the younger group members. Conversely, there was a desire amongst younger Pata people to harness the knowledge of their living kin and reflect on what was said in the past. It was anticipated that the marginalised voices of Pata leaders would be strengthened by the historical record if the two correlated. So what was actually being interpreted? Well, given the project required us to facilitate Pata people's improved understanding of their own systems, an interpretive report was produced and presented to the Pata State Group and Pata PBC members. The content of the report and presentation, that is the information being interpreted, included materials generated from land claim and native title research, as well as non-claim research, for instance, that produced by Spencer and Gillen, Stan Ostrello, and CLC clearance type activity. I note that in this region, past anthropological researchers and their Warramunga informants are generally viewed today by Warramunga people as credible and the records produced accurate, which I know in some other regions this is not the case. In terms of the content of the report highlighted consistencies and inconsistencies in the data over time and the research context in which the materials generated were explained. A wide variety of concrete examples of how the land tenure model and decision-making practices were applied over time were explained. For instance, individuals who were in the written record as actively protecting country and having authority to make decisions about Pata country were identified and their particular cases analysed. And a lot of the participants in the workshops and the meetings remember these times and talked about those experiences themselves. In other words, based on the written record, we presented historical examples of who had been exercising Pata native title rights over the previous 40 years. We noted their place within the Pata estate group and within the broader Warramunga society. We asked, why were these particular individuals holding up Pata country and encouraged discussion about whose job it is now? This approach took the focus away from the anthropological research results and provided native title holders with important information about how their system operated in the past. It provoked thoughtful consideration of what the present looked like and a discussion about the future. Diagrammatic tools were developed to assist senior people to explain the patrilineal system and the related decision-making roles for each category of affiliate to the group, according to the moiety system and mythological traditions and so on. Other traditional ways of becoming estate group members were also discussed, such as the acquisition of cultural knowledge and ceremonial status, and also categories of people who were not traditionally classified as estate members were also discussed, as was their potential role in the future based on certain traditional criteria. The project also involved a verbal repatriation of previous anthropological research materials at specific sites within Pata country, which was an effective vehicle to deliver concrete examples of who said what in the past, where they said it, and what was their role at the time. The physical use of the cultural landscape for the repatriation process fostered a better understanding of the materials being handed back. It taught younger people how to access Pata sites, of course being led by senior Pata people, and triggered people to consider who it would be next to speak up. terms of just a brief outline of some of the project outcomes, the community participation in the project design and delivery was high, indicating community support and interest in the process and the outcomes. As envisaged, the development of interpretive materials and the on-country repatriation process informed and empowered multiple generations by clearly defining roles and responsibilities, both amongst Parta Estate Group members and within the Parta Rulebook, the PBC Rulebook. Through the PBC, Parta people now have the tools to process membership applications according to their own laws and customs, as was their original desire. They can now articulate the reasons why a person can or cannot become a member of the PBC. From the perspective of the native title holders, the overall objective of the project was achieved, and that is Parta native title holders gain an understanding of how their land tenure system operates and how decisions are made. PBC members were also able to gain an internal perspective of the context in which they were operating, placing them in an improved decision-making position. Overall, Parta native title holders are now more confident in how they make decisions affecting their native title rights. Well, that's all for me for now, and I'll hand over to Joe if he's around, or to David. Thank you.
Okay, Joe, you with us?
Yes, I am.
All right, cool. All right, so Susan wrapped up in good time, so about 15 minutes, Joe, and then we'll go to David after you.
No worries, all right. So, all right, can everybody see me all right? Okay. My name's Joe Frerenew. I'm the manager of anthropology at the Northern Land Council, and my area, the subject that I wanted to talk about was the Wanyee, the estate group. So one particular estate group within the Wanyee-Garrawa Land Trust, Wanyee-Garrawa area. Wanyee-Garrawa, the Wanyee-Garrawa are located about 1,500 kilometres, approximately 1,500 kilometres southeast of Darwin, abutting the Queensland border in the Northern Territory. I'll go right into it, and I thought the reason I'm bringing this up, and I'm talking about it, is in 2021 and 2020, I'd been questioned by the executive members of the Borroloola Regional Council and the NLC executive about the veracity of the current anthropology concerning a particular estate groups, particularly the Wanyee-Garrawa area, and in particular the Woollaya, Woolgoringi and the Wadaya Woomera estate groups. I put in context, this is really about several years ago, there'd been several distributions about for the group, and it had always been complaints about people, the right people for the right country. And myself and other anthropologists, being new, had to try to investigate what was happening on the ground. But anyway, it led me to think about ownership of country and asking myself, how do people define ownership today? And usually when the Land Council does their traditional owner identification, we cast a wide net and include people who have, links patrilineally through their father's mother, mother's father, and mother's mother. And it delves back to accusations of people talking or making decisions about country that may or may not have. In one particular case, why I'm talking about the Waiala Wulgarinji and Wadaya Mumaja is that the Wadalia Wulgarinji group was stating that the members of the Wadalia Mumaja do not have the right to speak to country because they didn't belong to a particular country, or they weren't living on the country, and they didn't understand their connection to country. And so it was also about, the people were questioning the anthropology, stating that the anthropology was not correct, or that the anthropology was wrong in certain cases and places. They were, and so one of the things, that's why it led to me to think about, why we needed, why the anthropology needed to be discussed anyway. And there's also there was a different understanding between country ownership between the young and the older generations. The older generations were thinking, had a different understanding. They were thinking that they think the traditional ownership is patrilineally based, whereas the younger generation were thinking that no matter what connection to your country you had, you could be a decision maker. And in a sense, it's cognatic versus the patrilineal models. And that cognatic model seemed to be a lot more problematic to the older generations than it was to the younger generations. But in some cases, some of the older generations themselves were unclear of how people were connected to country. And the heart of some of the disputes is about who has rights to make decisions over country. Who were they? Who were these people? Especially when it came to making decisions about resources such as royalties. So this is the crux of the situation. It's about resources, and it's about royalties. How do they make decisions? Who are the right people for country? One of the ways I went about it to look at is reviewing the anthropological record, reviewing how in the old times and how decision making is so I was reviewing the way people made decisions to pass through the anthropological record, and I reviewed the Wanyigarawa land claim material, including the anthropology reports and transcripts, the genealogies and so forth. Then I reviewed the anthropology reports belonging to people such as Trigger and Dimmock, and as an aside, those old reports by Dimmock and Trigger are seen as a truth or a truth by people, and especially when they've been speaking to the older generations that have passed away. They're seeing that the information given to the anthropologists at that time is the right way, is the right thing, is what they believe in. It should be the right way. And I was reviewing current reports and trying to document change in country, a change in decision making, change in culture, that sort of thing. And what it is, and it may be across a lot of areas, is that there's a loss of knowledge, and loss of knowledge or knowledge attenuation contributes to loss of identity in place. Language loss, so it's found, contributes to loss of identity in place. Then there's even a misunderstanding in the local terms of father's fathers versus mother's father. In Wanyigarawa, there's a term of Mingaringi, which is loosely translated, or is translated as belonging to your father's country, or Junga and Jungai, which is translated as being as people belonging from connected through the mother's father. There was even and in some cases the people were saying that Jungai were the decision makers, not Mingaringi. Mingaringi, being fathers traditionally were thought to be the decision makers of country, but and more or less both of those connections to country were making decisions equally. I was trying to think of ways to manage the problem because of the dispute through the disbursement of monies. It was certainly problematic. So one of the ways that we thought that would be to help that, to try to mitigate those disputes or to curb them, was to remind people of what their parents and grandparents had said in the past to the anthropologists about country, about identity, about ownership, and so on. And rather than making broad statements about who belongs to it, where, as me as the current anthropologist, was letting the anthropological record speak for itself. But it was a way of repatriating knowledge of country to the relative people for country, and this included genealogies, stories, streaming, song cycles, and that to help orientate people to country. Certainly the working through the genealogies certainly helped people understand where they belong in country, and which group they belonged to and how they were connected to each other, because sometimes people had lost that connection and who were the families belonging to a particular group. So that was actually quite good. In a sense, by trying to make this, we were trying to mitigate or conciliate the disputes that are happening on the ground. I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done, I think, because we're still we still need to describe or to explore traditional decision making in its current form. Explore how people perceive decisions, how made in the past. Why did people think there is a need to return to the past? And certainly is that I think we need to begin. We need to better work at repatriating knowledge, because I think that's key. Part of the ways for doing that, we had to look at the what we quoted as we going back to what we did to that and doing that. Before the actual distribution meeting was done, we spent about a week and a half driving to where people lived within communities in Mount Isa, Doomadgee, and Borroloola, and talking about what people said in the past, repatriating that knowledge, and so it kind of started a conversation about people with people amongst themselves. I think it's not. There's a lot more to do in that respect, but that conversation is starting. So, in a sense, what we did was we talked about traditional ownership and how it's seen through the Lands Right Act, how it is seen, or ownership of native title through the Native Title Act, and so forth. And in a sense,
Joe.
No worries. Sorry if I'm rambling. And I guess why do people want to return to the past? Like I said before, I think they see it as a way to mitigate disputes. See, by repatriating knowledge, it gives people confidence in making decisions for their country. It may help understand who they are and where they come from. It may help people be confident in their identity. And all through this, that kind of had the backing of the executive from the Northern Land Council, and also the regional council members, some senior regional council members, because there was this kind of distrust about the anthropology, current anthropology, I must say. It was it kind of gave a sort of an authority to the anthropologists about doing what we did, and it also by repatriating knowledge, or trying to, it demonstrated to the regional and the council that the anthropology was actually sound. But in all, at least, whether right or wrong, it started a conversation between people and countrymen. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Joe. And I'd just like to remind everyone to please submit your questions through the Q&A button down the bottom. You can start putting them in now, and Simon Corey is going to be going through those, and we'll go through them after David's had a chance to talk. Is David there, ready to go?
Yeah.
All right, so we'll pass over to David. David was the author of the Nicholson River Land Claim Report that Joe was talking about with the Wanyagarawa, so it'll be interesting to hear his perspective on some of this stuff, and also what Susan had to say. Over to you, David.
Okay, thanks. I think there's a lot that could be discussed in what both Susan and Joe have said, obviously. I'll just try to run through maybe some big picture issues. I think the first thing I want to say is that while both of these cases are in the Northern Territory and both are influenced substantially by previous Land Rights Act research, it seems to me that the issues being raised are in fact continent-wide. There'll be differences across the continent in the details of the discussions about the importance of the anthropological record, but I think that in all jurisdictions, these issues about the standing of previous research and how it's to be implemented and understood for current assertions of rights is there for us to consider. I think a big picture issue is something that's been written about by anthropologists and others separate from the context of applied work or native title or land rights, and that is that both speakers have referred to the sort of articulation of a desire for no change, or a desire that actually consistent with the expectations of the Native Title Act, that there be above all a continuity from earlier versions of traditional law and custom. So there's a tension that anthropologists are aware of between a sort of what I think Bob Tonkinson many years ago in the Western Desert Maru case referred to as an ideology of non-change in the context of very substantial change. And people will have comment on that. I don't think it's when questioned and discussions occur, people on the ground will clearly acknowledge and talk about the forms of change. For example, younger generations no longer having the knowledge of one or two generations ago. But nevertheless, there's a desire to go back, as both speakers have said, to a sort of a return to, if you like, traditional knowledge that's no longer held or which has to be relearned. I think a big picture issue that emerges here is, yes, as both speakers have said, the anthropologists now can go back to previous documentation and research and repatriate that. But in the end, there's a bigger question for both native title and land rights registers of rights holders, in my view, which is that change is going to continue through time over the next few decades. It'll take various forms. There'll be greater loss of previously documented knowledge. There'll be new versions or innovations which will occur. And I think here of, or in this material, it's particularly the case. So across the continent, we see that precise genealogical connections to particular estates is not necessarily significant in many native title claims, where it'll be a more general membership based on ancestry of one kind or another, although in the Western Desert, as we know, across the desert areas, in fact, ancestry precisely defined in genealogical terms will also be less significant and made subject to questions of residence over time, birth affiliation of deceased forebears, and so on. So it's very interesting to look at the case Joe mentions, which involves, let's just hold it to the Wanya group for the moment, which straddles a cartographic border between the Northern Territory and Queensland. So not only does that mean somewhat different histories and different histories of change on both sides of on each side of the border, but it also means that the land trust area that Joe's talking about, resulting from land claims under the Land Rights Act and definitions of primary responsibility and so on, and derived from the work that I did and John Dimmock did years ago to address the legal definitions in the Land Rights Act. But that sits against, right adjacent to successful native title claims on the Queensland side. So on the Queensland side, we've got functioning PBC and the holders of native title rights, much more broadly defined than the earlier work in the 1980s, where the living older generation, as Joe says, went back as best they could to what was understood then to be traditional rules for semi-moiety skin, ceremonial connections, and so on. So it's a really interesting microcosm of the issue, where you've got the Northern Territory Queensland border bifurcating very different definitions of rights holding. And yet people hold rights on both sides of the border as they see it, according to living traditional law and custom. So I'll leave that alone. Others may have quite a bit to say about that. I think this also takes us to the ambiguity of orally inherited cultural information compared to what's available in documentation. Again, this is an issue for native title claims right across the country. In my mind, it's not actually clear in the end how legal process will regard this, because my reading is that we've got sometimes an acknowledgement that there will be substantial use of written documentation legitimately as part of contemporary law and custom. In other cases, especially where there might be argumentation across those asserting rights, then there'll be a view that it's less authentic in terms of traditional law to be drawing particularly on written documentation, anthropological or otherwise, than on orally inherited information. I think that also comes up. I know in Susan's work, though I'm not sure, it might be in her written notes, I'm not sure whether Susan addressed it now, but the problem for the anthropologist of giving people the answers. So as Susan says, people want to ask, well, what did the old people say? Well, yes, so repatriation in the report form that was commissioned by the Central Land Council and then Susan was able to do, encompasses the anthropologist providing that information. Well, here it all is here written down, but does that compromise the integrity of the anthropologist's current inquiries, particularly if there's a desire, as I think there should be, from anthropology to address and accommodate forms of cultural change? So giving people answers which then get reproduced but remain in tension, let's say with what younger people then go on to continue to believe, or more flexible versions of the rules, can be a problem. Susan also mentioned in her notes something very important, which is the way arguments about who's right and who's wrong and who's sticking with the most credible previous anthropological material can be a foil for, or at least a masking of, the arguments that Joe mentioned over money and or to fend off encroaching interests from adjacent groups who might be introducing contesting views. The anthropology, of course, and anthropologists may be sought as an ally, or will be sought as an ally for particular positions. Now, I just wanted to mention one practical issue, which I think is really important, but very hard to address, and that is when we repatriate the earlier results of research, this might sound a trite, small issue, but I want to talk about spelling and orthography. I want to talk about the capacity of living rights holders and claimants and others to read what anthropologists have written. There's a very disabling problem where readers of standard English, speakers of standard English, whether or not they're fluent in their own language or know vocabulary and so on to speak with, have great difficulty reading our technical writing. And this is a huge issue which has had argumentation between linguists and anthropologists over the years. I don't have a big answer. I think those of us involved in this will be asked to pronounce words as well as show written spellings of them. We'll be rung up by people increasingly who want to give a bush name to a new baby and want to know how to spell it because they can't read from the reportage that's been done in the technical work of anthropologists. Particularly, this is about vowels, of course, rather than consonants, but it's the same thing. I'm interested to hear what other people might want to say about that. And just quickly, can the anthropology be wrong? Can the previous anthropology be wrong? Well, the anthropologists like me and others who wrote it or write it will no doubt say, I will say, no, I wasn't wrong. But what I do need to acknowledge, going back again, is the difficulty to avoid either the Native Title Act or the Land Rights Act or whatever else is going to be operating in other jurisdictions to stifle change that is occurring subsequent to the legal decisions about who holds rights. It will be a travesty, I think, if registers of rights holders, whether held by PBCs or land councils or NTRBs, come to be imposed without addressing change. Now, if I'm allowed just one final comment about our legal colleagues, I think our legal colleagues are not good at addressing this question because they're interested, understandably, in the definition of rights arising out of legal cases, and then you're done and dusted and you move on. And when decisions have to be made, you go and you consult those legal decisions or the versions of them which have been put into land interest registers and so on. This is a big arena for anthropology going forward to assist, I think, our colleagues, our legal colleagues and others to I would encourage us to be not really speculative, but to acknowledge we don't have all the answers, but to be able to talk about change in ways that on the ground we're able to observe all of the different factors